She hadn't even looked up when he walked into the boardroom, all sharp suit, sharper smirk, and the kind of presence that turned every head without him saying a word. To Eleanor Hayes, he was just another arrogant billionaire CEO, untouchable in his confidence and careless in his words. But then he leaned against the polished mahogany table, eyes glittering with mockery, and said the 7 words that would change her life forever. "Get this deal done and I'll marry you." The room erupted in nervous laughter, as though he had cracked the funniest joke of the century. But Eleanor didn't laugh. She raised her chin, her pulse quickening with a heat she couldn't name. He thought she'd break, that she'd stumble and prove him right. What he didn't know was that Eleanor had been underestimated her entire life. And this time, she was done staying small. Eleanor's hands trembled under the table as the meeting carried on. She tried to focus on the slides, the numbers flashing across the projector, but her mind kept circling back to his words. James Whitmore, 38, billionaire, widowed, and notorious for cutting down anyone who dared disappoint him, had just turned her career into a joke. Or was it? He smirked at her across the table, his gaze lingering just long enough to burn through her calm facade. She wanted to shout back, to tell him she wasn't afraid. But all she managed was a steady voice as she asked the client another question, her professionalism wrapping tightly around her like armor. The clients leaned in, impressed. James raised an eyebrow. The meeting ended with a handshake, but Eleanor knew the dare had been planted like a seed in the air. As people shuffled out, he paused at the doorway, glanced at her with that infuriating smile, and said quietly, "Don't take it so seriously." Her heart hammered. She didn't answer. She couldn't, because in that moment, she decided she would. The next morning, London's winter fog hung heavy outside the office windows, but Eleanor felt sharper than she had in years. She walked into the building with her shoulders back and her mind set. This wasn't about James. It wasn't even about his impossible challenge. It was about proving to herself that she was more than the overlooked junior who fetched coffee, stayed late, and fixed other people's mistakes. She dove into research, combing through files, building connections with international partners who had ignored their calls for months. The deal James had tossed out like a joke wasn't just big, it was the merger that could shift the company's future across Europe and the U.S. It was messy, dangerous, and politically fraught, exactly the kind of thing James knew she'd never pull off. But Eleanor had a weapon no one saw coming: her ability to listen. While others talked over the table, she caught the hesitation in a client's voice, the soft details that mattered. And slowly, her quiet persistence began to turn heads. That night, exhausted but burning with adrenaline, she left the office to find James waiting outside. His coat collar was turned up against the chill, his expression unreadable. "You're really trying, aren't you?" he asked. She met his eyes for the first time without flinching. "Yes," she said, "and I'll finish it." James wasn't used to being challenged. Most people laughed at his jokes, nodded at his orders, and never dared push back. But Eleanor had steel in her voice that intrigued him more than he cared to admit. As he watched her walk away that night, he felt the flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: curiosity. Still, he told himself it was nothing. He had bigger problems. His 6-year-old daughter, Sophie, had been having nightmares again. He'd hired the best nannies money could buy, but Sophie only grew quieter, hiding behind her books and dolls. James knew he was failing her, though he would never admit it out loud. The next week at work, he found himself watching Eleanor in meetings, noticing the way she leaned in when someone spoke, the way her pen tapped when an idea sparked. She was relentless. He caught himself smiling once, then quickly covered it with a cough. And when Sophie appeared in his office unexpectedly one afternoon, clinging to his leg, it was Eleanor who knelt down first, softening her voice, and asked, "What's your favorite storybook? Sophie whispered an answer. James blinked, stunned. He couldn't remember the last time his daughter had spoken to a stranger. The deal wasn't just numbers on a page anymore. It was a battlefield. Rival firms sniffed out their plans, clients grew skittish, and whispers of sabotage slithered through the corridors. Eleanor knew someone inside the company wanted her to fail. Files went missing. Calls dropped mysteriously. She stayed late, red-eyed and worn thin, but her determination only sharpened. James noticed. He began stopping by her desk under the guise of updates. At first, his words were laced with sarcasm. "Don't burn out before you get me to the altar," he teased once. But when he caught her fighting back tears over a lost contract, something shifted. Instead of mocking, he pulled up a chair beside her. Together, they reworked the pitch from scratch. He had the ruthless instincts. She had the empathy to make clients trust again. Their arguments crackled, their laughter spilled over at odd hours, and somewhere in between the spreadsheets and coffee cups, an invisible thread began to tie them together. Late one night, after the building emptied, Eleanor caught him watching her. His eyes softened, unguarded, and for a split second she saw not the arrogant CEO, but a man carrying grief and exhaustion. The moment passed quickly, but it was enough to leave her breathless. Sophie became part of the picture in ways Eleanor never expected. The little girl had a way of slipping past her father's icy exterior, and soon she slipped into Eleanor's evenings too. Sometimes when Eleanor stayed late, James would bring Sophie in with a coloring book, leaving her in the corner of the office. Inevitably, Sophie would wander over to Eleanor's desk. They built quiet rituals, crayons scattered between documents, whispered stories told in low voices. Eleanor found herself softening, too, remembering what it felt like to be a child overlooked in a loud world. Sophie's trust felt like a gift she didn't deserve, but one she guarded fiercely. James noticed, though he said nothing. He only watched, jaw tightening when Sophie laughed, the sound echoing like a bell he hadn't heard in years. It scared him how much he wanted to see Eleanor in their world beyond the office. But he wasn't ready to admit it. Not yet. The sabotage grew bolder. Anonymous emails accused Eleanor of lying to clients. Rumors spread through the company, and suddenly, colleagues who once praised her began to step back. It hurt more than she expected. She'd given her loyalty. And this was the thanks. One night she found her desk ransacked, documents shredded. Her stomach dropped, rage trembling in her hands. James arrived minutes later, his face dark as thunder. For once, there was no smirk. "Who did this?" he demanded, but she only shook her head, choking back tears. Instead of brushing it off, he stayed. He helped her pick up the papers, his large hands clumsy among the scraps. "You're not alone in this," he said quietly. She wanted to believe him. For the first time, she wondered if his promise, his ridiculous, careless promise, meant more than either of them had realized. The merger talks moved to Paris, and Eleanor found herself stepping onto a plane with James at her side. The city unfolded beneath them like a dream, golden lights spilling across the Seine. But the stakes were real, and higher than ever. At the hotel, she prepared presentations until dawn while James paced the suite, firing off last-minute calls. Their arguments sharpened, but so did their teamwork. They were becoming a strange kind of balance, his fire, her calm. On the morning of the pitch, Eleanor felt the weight of it all pressing down, her career, her dignity, his dare. But as she stood before the clients, James caught her eye from the back of the room, gave the smallest of nods, and suddenly she wasn't alone. She nailed it. Every word landed, every graph supported. And when the signatures finally went onto paper, James let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "You did it," he whispered afterward. And for once, there was no smirk, just pride. Back in London, the office buzzed with celebration. The deal was hailed as historic, newspapers splashing headlines across both sides of the Atlantic. Eleanor was the name on everyone's lips. James threw a gala in the company's glass tower, champagne flowing and music filling the air. Eleanor arrived in a navy dress, simple but elegant, and James couldn't take his eyes off her. Colleagues whispered, noticing the way the CEO's gaze lingered too long, the way his smile softened only when she walked by. But even in the glittering lights, shadows lingered. The saboteur wasn't done. Eleanor overheard conversations that night, murmurs of jealousy, of people determined to ruin her. She brushed it off, but the knot in her stomach tightened. When James approached her on the balcony offering a drink, she accepted with a weary smile. "You still owe me a wedding, remember?" she teased. He laughed, but something in his eyes said he wasn't sure if it was a joke anymore. The office glow felt colder when Eleanor returned the next week. Whispers trailed her through corridors, admiration laced with envy. Success had placed a target on her back. Someone, somewhere, wanted her gone. She tried to ignore it, burying herself in work, but unease gnawed at her. James, meanwhile, walked with a sharper edge. He had seen the sabotage escalate. He had men checking emails, tracing files, but the mole remained a shadow. He told himself it was about the company, but deep down he knew. He was protecting her. Late one night, as Eleanor sat hunched over her desk, she heard a noise. Papers shuffled, a drawer clicked. When she turned, a junior associate slipped out the door, face pale. Her heart pounded as she realized the war wasn't just external, it was inside their walls. When James stormed in moments later, she didn't hide the truth. "They're trying to destroy me," she whispered. He studied her face, then said with finality, "Then they'll have to go through me first." The board meeting the next morning was brutal. Executives questioned Eleanor's methods, her relationships with clients, her sudden rise. Some even hinted she had used James to climb the ladder. The humiliation burned, but Eleanor refused to break. James sat at the head of the table, silent at first, letting them dig their pit. Then he rose, voice cutting like steel. "She closed a deal none of you could touch. If you think she needed me, you're wrong. I needed her." The room froze. It was the first time he'd publicly defended anyone that fiercely. Afterward, Eleanor found him waiting outside, hands shoved in his pockets. "You didn't have to," she began, but he cut her off. "Yes, I did." His gaze lingered, heavy with things unsaid. For the first time, the line between them blurred. Not just boss and junior, not just dare and challenge. Something deeper was breaking through. Sophie became their quiet witness. She appeared in James's office more often now, her tiny frame curled up with a book, her eyes flicking shyly toward Eleanor whenever she visited. Slowly, she began to speak more, her soft voice asking Eleanor about fairy tales and favorite colors. One evening, when James was late, Sophie tugged Eleanor's sleeve. "Do you like Daddy?" she asked, her innocence disarming. Eleanor froze, unsure what to say. "He's difficult sometimes," she answered honestly. Sophie giggled. "He says you're difficult too." James walked in moments later, catching them both mid-laughter. Something inside him shifted at the sight. His daughter's smile, Eleanor's warmth. It felt like a glimpse of a life he thought he'd lost forever. But as quickly as the thought came, he buried it. Life wasn't that simple. Not for him, not for her. The rival firm struck hard. A confidential proposal leaked. Their numbers, their strategies, their client lists. Panic erupted across the company. James's empire trembled, and Eleanor's fingerprints were suspiciously close to the leak. The accusations were sharp, relentless. HR called her in. Lawyers hovered. Eleanor sat in the glass room, staring at the skyline, wondering how quickly a life could crumble. She had fought tooth and nail, only to be branded a traitor. But James didn't believe it. He stormed into the meeting, demanding evidence, shredding their case with his sharp mind and sharper temper. "If you're going to accuse her," he growled, "you'd better come with more than rumors." When the meeting adjourned, Eleanor collapsed against the wall, tears burning her eyes. James stood close, too close. "You'll get through this," he murmured. She wanted to believe him, but she wasn't sure she could. Eleanor thought about quitting. She drafted a resignation letter, her fingers trembling over the keys. Pride told her she could find another path, another company. But her heart whispered that walking away meant letting them win. That night, she lingered by the river, city lights shimmering on the Thames. To her surprise, James appeared beside her, his coat collar turned up against the wind. "Running away?" he asked softly. She shook her head, eyes wet. "Maybe surviving." For once, he didn't tease. He simply stood there, the silence between them stretching, unspoken emotions crowding the air. Finally, he said, "Stay. Not for me. For yourself. For what you've built." And when she looked at him, she saw it, not arrogance, not pity, but respect. Determined, Eleanor returned to the fight. She rebuilt the case, chased down leads, and finally uncovered the truth. The leak came from a senior executive desperate for power. She gathered proof quietly, her resolve sharp as glass. When she presented it to James, his face darkened with fury. "I trusted him," he muttered. Eleanor touched his arm gently. "You trusted too few people and the wrong one." Their eyes locked, the air thick with understanding. At the next board meeting, James let Eleanor lead the reveal. Her voice was steady, her evidence undeniable. The traitor was escorted out, and the board members who had doubted her stared in stunned silence. James leaned back, a ghost of a smile on his lips. She hadn't just saved herself, she had saved him. Victory tasted bittersweet. Eleanor knew she had proven herself, but the scars of betrayal lingered. At night, she dreamed of papers scattered, voices accusing. Yet when she walked into the office each morning, she held her head higher. James watched her differently now, not as a junior executive, not as the girl he had dared, but as someone who had rebuilt his crumbling empire piece by piece. He couldn't stop himself from admiring her. One evening, he invited her and Sophie to dinner at his townhouse. The air smelled of roasted chicken and cinnamon. Eleanor felt out of place at first, but Sophie's chatter and James's rare smile softened the edges. For a few hours, it wasn't about deals or boardrooms. It was about laughter, warmth, and something dangerously close to home. But the walls James had built around his heart didn't crumble easily. After dinner, as Eleanor left, he pulled back. "This can't happen," he said abruptly. "You and me, it's complicated." Her breath caught. "I didn't ask for anything," she whispered. But the sting cut deep. He wanted to explain. The grief of losing his wife, the fear of giving Sophie another heartbreak, the danger of mixing business with desire. But the words tangled in his throat. He only watched as she walked away, the night air swallowing her figure. For days, the office felt colder. Their conversations clipped, their gazes avoiding. But the ache in his chest only grew stronger. Eleanor tried to bury herself in work again, but nothing felt the same. The success she had fought for felt hollow. Every corridor reminded her of him. Every glance at Sophie twisted the knife deeper. Meanwhile, James battled his own demons. He had pushed her away to protect her, or so he told himself. But as he sat in his penthouse at night, Sophie asleep upstairs, he realized he was the one unraveling. The breaking point came when Sophie asked him, "Why doesn't Eleanor come over anymore?" The innocence in her eyes broke him. He couldn't lie. "Because Daddy made a mistake," he admitted softly. And for the first time in years, he knew he had to fix it. The company prepared for a massive annual gala in New York, the crown jewel of their year. Eleanor was chosen to present the keynote, her reputation now untouchable. She accepted, though her heart weighed heavy. James flew in days earlier, restless. He hadn't spoken to her properly in weeks. He told himself he would let her shine, let her take the stage without his shadow. But when he saw her step onto that glittering platform in a gown of midnight blue, he realized he couldn't stay silent any longer. Her words captivated the room, a speech about resilience, integrity, and the power of being underestimated. She ended to thunderous applause. James stood frozen, pride and regret warring inside him. Later, as the crowd dispersed, he found her by the window overlooking Manhattan. "You were brilliant," he said. She turned, her eyes guarded. "I didn't do it for you." He stepped closer, voice low. "I know, but I should have told you sooner. You're the best thing that's happened to this company." "And to me?" Eleanor's heart thudded painfully. She wanted to believe him, but wounds ran deep. "You can't play games with people, James. Not with me." He swallowed hard, his arrogance stripped bare. "It was never a game. I thought I was protecting myself, protecting Sophie. But all I did was push away the one person who makes us feel whole again." Her resolve cracked, but she held firm. "Then prove it. Not with promises, with actions." Fate gave him that chance sooner than expected. Another rival launched a public smear campaign, twisting Eleanor's past, dragging her family name into tabloids. Headlines screamed betrayal, though the truth was thin. James reacted instantly. He called a press conference, stood before cameras, and declared the truth. He laid his reputation on the line, openly crediting Eleanor for saving the company, denouncing the lies, and making it clear she was not just his employee, but someone he respected beyond measure. The world watched, stunned. For James Whitmore, guarded and untouchable, to stand so openly for someone, it meant everything. When he returned backstage, Eleanor stood waiting, tears brimming. For the first time, she believed him. Their walls finally fell. They talked, really talked, through the night. About grief, about fear, about what it meant to start again. James confessed he hadn't laughed the way he laughed with her since his wife died. Eleanor admitted she hadn't felt seen until he dared her to rise. It wasn't easy. They argued, they doubted, but the thread between them held stronger than before. Sophie only sealed it, her small hand clutching Eleanor's during a walk in Central Park, as if she had already chosen her place in their world. James watched them together, his chest aching with a strange, dangerous hope, and for the first time, he didn't run from it. Months later, the company thrived, stronger than ever. Eleanor's name carried weight across the industry, her voice no longer overlooked, and James was no longer just the billionaire with a smirk. He was a man who had learned to love again. On a quiet spring evening in London, he stood with Eleanor in the same boardroom where it all began. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass. He leaned against the table, eyes soft, and whispered, "Do you remember what I said that day?" Her smile trembled. "That you'd marry me if I closed the deal." He took her hand, his voice steady now. "I wasn't joking." This time, she laughed through tears. Not because she thought it was funny, but because she knew he meant it. And as Sophie's laughter echoed down the hall, Eleanor realized she had gained more than a career, more than respect. She had gained a family.